She came back to the United States in 2014, was a research fellow at the Simon Scott Institute for Genocide and Mass Atrocity Prevention at the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum in Washington, D.C. And has now, in the last couple of years, founded a new organization called Project Over Zero, which works primarily now in Central Europe and in the United States to build resilience and counter the development of identity-based violence and identity-based hatreds in those regions. She's an expert on the way that communication works both for as an atrocity driver, but also as a counter to atrocity risks. She has a lot to say to us. I'm really looking forward to her presentation called Weaponization and Preventative Potential for Communication and Atrocity Prevention. Please join me in giving a warm welcome to Rachel Brown.
Thank you. All right, so I have lots of things to talk about, and I can talk a lot. So please raise your hand if you have questions as I go, and I'm gonna sort of, instead of just presenting all at once and then opening it up for Q&A, I'm gonna pause for questions so that we can cover a few different subject areas. So I wanted to start off by talking about this idea of this linkage between communication and conflict. And to me, this is a really foundational idea, and it's really part of the foundation of all the work that I've done. And when I think about what connects the work that I've done across different places, from Kenya to Myanmar to the US and Central Europe, it really is this linkage between communication and conflict. And if I've been to your class, I'm repeating myself now to you. But the type of violence that my organization Over Zero works to prevent, identity-based violence and other forms of group-targeted harm, targeting people based on their identity. This is violence that happens between groups. And this type of violence is not possible. You cannot have this type of violence without communication being used to pave the way, to coordinate it, and really throughout the cycle of violence. And that's because communication is part of how we interact with each other as a species. It's how we make sense of the events around us. It's how we form groups. It's the only way that we take collective action is by communicating with each other and mobilizing it. So again, communication and identity-based violence or intergroup violence are inextricably linked. And whenever you see intergroup violence or identity-based violence, communication will be playing a role of some sort. And so this is really the subject that's fascinated me, that's driven me for about the past decade of work. But as Max mentioned, I really got my start in Kenya. These are images, I should have warned you before putting them up, but these are images of Kenya's 2007-2008 post-election violence. Kenya in 2007 was no stranger to election-related violence. There's a history of violence following and around elections throughout Kenya's history, but the scale, the geographic spread, the duration, the intensity of this violence was unlike what Kenya had experienced before. Over 1,000 people were killed, hundreds of thousands were displaced, entire areas and neighborhoods were destroyed, and the violence lasted for a long time. It started following an election in December 2017, and it lasted on throughout early 2018, the first month or so. And when I first went to Kenya in 2009 as a student, I was interested in studying conflict. I was interested in understanding conflict. And I sort of went because this violence had happened, and I wanted to understand it better. And I ended up staying. I ended up moving to Kenya and starting CC Amani when I started talking to local peace activists. And I learned from them that in addition to the weapons that you see here, in addition to the gas and the matches, to machetes, to police fired bullets and guns, cell phones, which were new in Kenya at the time, which were newly ubiquitous across the country in 2007, 2008, were used as a weapon for violence. These are really simple cell phones, right? We're talking about text messages here and forwarded text messages between family and friends. And the phones were used for fear-mongering, for spreading rumors and misinformation in the lead up to the election, for coordinating weapons distribution, attacks, gathering lists of names as the violence continued, for sharing information. Our group is being targeted over here. Can you take revenge over there where you are in this other part of the country? So it helped facilitate the geographic spread of the violence, the speed of the violence, the coordination of the violence, but it also, again, in the months leading up, helped pave the way. And so I ended up, I moved to Kenya in 2010, and I stayed there for 4 years working with local activists to really try and answer this question. there's a tool that's being used for violence. It's a tool, it's communication, right? But it's being turned from a tool into a weapon. So how can we use this same tool, this very powerful, fundamentally part of being human tool, and how can we instead use it as a tool for peace? And so that was really the foundational question for CC Niamani, the organization that I worked with a lot of peace builders in Kenya to found and to work on over the course for 4 years. And I would say that this is the question that's really animated me throughout all the work that I've done since then, and that continues to bother me and motivate me. So I want to share with you a little bit about how we answered this question. And some of you have heard me talk about this, but now you get pictures, even if you have. So we started this organization called CC Niamani. It means We Are Peace in Kiswahili. And it was a way for local peace activists to come together, to work together around a brand or an identity, this We Are Peace identity, and to organize to be able to use that same particular channel of communication, cell phone technology and text messages, to organize and coordinate for peace. And so we did, let's see if it'll, this one seems a little stuck. I can keep, oh really? I'll pause for a second just because I want to show you the images of how, there we go. That's okay, perfect. So we started this organization, we created this brand of CC Niamani, and what we decided was, one of the key insights, we sort of mapped out all the different communication flows from a rumor, a piece of misinformation, or a piece of communication all the way to violence. How did it spread through a community? Both through text messages, forwarded text messages, but also through people's in-person interactions at the marketplace when they went to buy something at a kiosk or on the side of the road. So we really mapped out these information flows throughout communities. And we decided that what we needed to do was we needed to build a system that, because fear was always going to mobilize people to share information. When there's a rumor that says, these people, they're coming to get you, they're coming to get us, they're arming, people were going to spread that, right? You want to protect your family and friends. We weren't going to be able to compete with the pace of the spread of information that might incite violence. But what we could do is we could get ahead of the game. What if we could go in the communities and get people's phone numbers in advance? What if when we found out about a rumor, we could reach 5,000 people pretty quickly with a blast message? So what we did is we developed this text messaging platform, and we did proactive work for years. We went through door-to-door outreach. Our team subscribed 65,000 people in 20 targeted communities to this platform. And in doing so, they went out into the communities. This is an outreach event. You can see the branded t-shirts, you can see the stickers. They recruited people who were key information spreaders already in the community. So they built on to the existing social capital and the existing structures of relationships and information. This guy, he rides this motorcycle and he transports people around. He's a key information source for his community. This woman runs a kiosk. People are coming in and out of her shop all day. She's a key information source. We specifically went out, the outreach teams identified who were these influencers within their community, and they equipped them with things like the stickers and the outreach materials so that they could also subscribe more people. And then once we had people subscribed in key communities, those teams of volunteers that had gone out to bring them on board were the same ones to monitor tensions and to activate a response through the messaging platform. So through all of this, what we did is that in the post-election violence in Kenya, people's identities were activated, but really divisive identities for them, right? Their identity in terms of a political party or a tribe or ethnic community. So we built CC Niamani as a new identity, one that cut across conflict lines. But to join CC Niamani, you didn't have to give up your belonging to your tribe or your language. You didn't have to give up your political party. It was a multi-partisan organization. But and so we had people who supported all different political parties, really hardcore supporters across the board. But we built a new identity that brought them together and was additive onto their identities that were being mobilized for conflict. And we set strong norms. We really promoted this idea that most people were going to act peacefully, and setting this standard of this is what we're going to do if we have a grievance. We're going to ask questions before we spread rumors because we won't let them divide us. So we use the messaging platform to be really proactive. And we also, like I explained before, we tapped into the existing information-related behaviors and the social capital in a community. We didn't build something external to communities. We worked with people that were already in their communities, playing key roles in spreading information, playing key roles in mitigating conflict and in mediating, right? And they were the ones, this was a new tool in their hands. This wasn't starting something separate. This was building on what communities were already doing and what people were already doing. And because we had the infrastructure, we were able to be proactive too and do things like civic education and civic engagement. We started a political debates program, right? This was another thing to bring people across party lines, across conflict lines, to talk about really specific issues in their community. I might love this politician and you love that politician, but whoever wins, we want them to fix the open sewage line that's running through the road, right? So we did community needs assessments. We used the platform, the text messaging platform, to gather a lot of data and information to poll people on their needs and the issues that they cared about, and then to send out messages inviting them to come to these local political debates. It also gave us the platform to say to a local candidate who didn't want to come talk to the community and answer questions, oh, well, we've invited 5,000 people in your community, would you like to show up? So it started giving also a little bit more power to people in these communities who might want to ask questions of their leaders. And again, this was multiple channels. You can see how here the text messaging is activated to invite people in to gather information, but they're coming to an in-person event and engaging there in person. We worked with the local radio stations to play back, to record and play back the debates and host call-in conversations with the community, and then to advertise for the next one. So we weren't just operating in one silo. This is just a text messaging approach. It was really thinking about how can we filter into the information ecosystem that already exists. I'll just finish quickly telling you my own story because I spent 4 years in Kenya with CC Niamani. I left in 2014. We transitioned the organization. Our whole staff, our programs, our funding went to 2 larger Kenyan-led civil society organizations to keep using those programs and infrastructure that we have built to do a lot more political accountability and participation in governance. So really getting at some of those root causes of conflict. I went on and, as Max mentioned, I was a fellow with the Simon Scott Center for Prevention of Genocide at the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum. And there they had really started looking at what they call dangerous speech, the speech that we see in the communication patterns that we see, and I'll talk more about this in a minute, over and over and over again where there are genocides and mass atrocities. And they wanted to say, besides for censoring and punishing people for this speech, which is limited in its impact and in the capacity to do it, what are other approaches? So I wrote with them this set of books called Diffusing Hate that drew from every discipline, right? Because conflict doesn't just happen through our psychology or our brains or our social interactions. It happens through all of these, right? So I looked at social psych, neuroscience, marketing, political science, everything that I could get my hands on to say, what do we know about how communication impacts conflict? How does this jibe with what my own experience was in Kenya, what I've heard from other peace builders and know from that sector, and really start to gather those, an audit of those insights. And then from there, I started Over Zero with this nice, funny name. It's a math joke. Any number over 0 can't be divided, right? It's not possible to divide a number by 0. And we see this type of speech and communication that gets used to incite violence as a real manipulation of a society, right? It taps into existing fault lines and grievances to divide and ultimately justify and mobilize some for violence and others to silence, apathy, disengagement. And so we really wanted to figure out how, when you start to see these patterns of speech emerging, can you resist their impact? How can you make societies able to not be manipulated and not fall prey to sort of the dynamics of this speech? And that's really where we focus, is this question of what can you do? And there's such a clear playbook, and I'll talk about it in a second. It seems like this pattern that emerges over and over and over again to weaponize communication. How can we start to really build that playbook for what we do when we see the weaponization of communication emerging? So in terms of the activities we do, in case it's useful to know, we do a lot of trainings and education and providing tools and resources to different civil society organizations. We help pilot and test different programs, and we facilitate interdisciplinary collaboration between researchers and civil society practitioners who are trying new things. I want to talk about the patterns of speech that we see that I was just mentioning, but I know this is me talking a lot, so I really want to pause in case anyone, that's what I'm going to say about my own personal story. I'll come back a little bit to CC Niamani, but do you have questions before I keep going? Okay, don't be shy. Next time, ask them. So there are really clear patterns, and there's people that have studied them from all over. There's Jonathan Leader Maynard and Susan Ben Nesh and Scott Strauss, all of these different people who have studied genocide and mass atrocities from different angles. And so there's really clear patterns that emerge in the speech and the rhetoric that leads up to genocide and mass atrocities. Perhaps very obviously, it creates an other, right? It creates a them, a group that's being targeted. Within this, we see a few different things, right? Pretty consistently, the group that's being targeted is portrayed as threatening, okay? This group is a threat to our way of life, to our purity, to our assets and our status, right? Somehow, this group in its existence or in what it's planning to do or what it's already doing poses a threat. So if I am in a court of law and I would like to mount a defense for myself, that you all are going to let me, you're going to be okay with me having done whatever I might have done, right? You're going to say, it's okay, Rachel, you were reasonable. What is my defense? What's my best defense? Self-defense, right? Right? This threat narrative is like mass level self-defense, right? We are not acting proactively. We don't hate anybody. We're not the aggressors. We're the defenders. And you can see this in the Rwandan genocide. Hutu propagandists called it accusation in a mirror. We're going to accuse them of doing what we're planning to do, accuse the Tutsi of planning a genocide against us. So if we don't take action, right, we'll all be killed. And you see this over and over again. They're a threat to us. Within this, that purity question, you also often see narratives about they'll rape our women, which is an objectification of women. And it also gets to this idea of sort of like the purity of a group, right? The second thing that comes up again, and this Jonathan Leader Maynard talks a lot about this, and you can also see this with like a lot of the research that's done on scapegoating, right? But the group that's being targeted is guilty, right? They've already done something bad and punishable. Now again, across societies, once someone has been defined as guilty, people tend to be okay with a punishment that you wouldn't accept, with doing things to them, with taking away rights that otherwise society wouldn't accept, right? So there's this painting of an entire group, not just this person did something bad, but some people from that group did something bad, and it means that that whole group is guilty of it, even children, even if the bad thing was done generations ago, right? So this could be they were violent to us before, they've wronged us in the past, this other group is responsible for the economic downturn, right? This is the scapegoating, they're responsible for our woes. And then we often see really dehumanizing language. The dehumanizing language often taps into the threat, right? It's comparing groups of people to vermin, to pests, rabid dogs, right? This is dehumanizing. This is not comparing people to friendly animals. It's dehumanizing in a way that portrays a group as threatening and removes them from the universe of moral obligation. The thing that gets a little less attention often, or maybe it's just a little less obvious when you just look at this communication and this rhetoric on its face, is that there's not an us-them divide without an us, right? It's pretty easy to see them being defined. But so much of this speech is not just about talking about the threat or the need to target a group. It's also mobilizing the perpetrators, right? It's speaking to the in-group to say, this is why you have to come and join us. And there's patterns in this speech too, right? Ooh, my formatting is a little off. We are moral. We don't have a choice, okay? We are not subject to how we would usually judge ourselves for acting morally on whether violence is okay or not. We actually don't have any other choice besides to use violence. It's not that we want to. We're not mean, we're not bad, but because that other group is so threatening, to be moral and to protect our own group, we actually have to take violent action. And so you see the activation of the pressures, the social pressures, the peer pressure within a group to go along with the violence, right? If you're really a good member of our group, then you will support this, you'll go along with it, you'll participate. If you're a good man, you will certainly be participating in the violence. And if you speak out against it, well, you must not really be one of us. You don't care about your own group. You don't want to protect our women and children. You're pretty naive and stupid if you don't think that other group is a threat. But at worst, you might actually be one of them and you might be a traitor, right? So this starts to silence the people that might speak up within a perpetrator group against violence. And there is the narrative that I just mentioned of protecting the vulnerable, right? Violence isn't just justifiable, it's necessary and it's actually heroic because you're protecting people like children, women who can't protect themselves, right? And there's also this idea that we're creating a better future. This is a price we have to pay today, but like, you don't make an omelet without cracking some eggs, right? Like this is the argument that they're making. We're paying a price today, we're hurting some people, but it's gonna be worth it in the long term, and there's no way to get to this better future unless we engage in this harm. And these are really perpetrator-focused narratives, and I think I really wanted to highlight them because I think they're often less obvious to us, but they're just as important because they're what helps mobilize some people to action, but also to silence others, right? It makes it very hard to dissent for credible voices within the perpetrator groups to dissent. And so I want to transition to point out that when we think about how we respond to these dynamics and how we respond to this speech, we have to think about the broader societal impact. It's not just the usually relatively small group of people that perpetrates the violence or is mobilized to actually be a direct perpetrator, but it's all the others who are mobilized to support it, to repeat this type of rhetoric, to paint violence as a moral and a good thing, to provide material support, to support in terms of spreading communication, but also to disengage, right? And to decide it's too costly for me to speak up against this, or this doesn't really have to do with me. I don't know if that group is a threat or not, right? So when we think about intervening, we have to think not just about intervening on the extreme level, but where are the other sources of resilience and other pockets within society that we could activate to help resist this type of violence and to keep the extremes as an extreme rather than dominating the discourse. So we also have to think about the spectrum of interventions and actions. And I wanted to give just a couple of examples of the types of interventions that we can think about. I talked a lot about norms, right? And how norms shift. And suddenly, instead of it being unacceptable and scary to speak up for violence, now it becomes a lot scarier, especially if you're a member of the group being mobilized for perpetration, to speak out and to say, I don't think violence is okay. I don't think it's good. I think we should try and talk to this other group. I don't think they're all responsible for what a couple of people did, right? So one of the things we can think about intervening with is this question of, can we notice early on when norms are starting to shift and prevent them from doing so? I would say that's something that's particularly relevant when we look at upstream prevention, like the work we're doing in the US right now. We can also ask, how do you set norms? We care about the norms or sort of the informal rules of behavior. We care about it for our peer groups. Like I always think about high school cliques, right? Or middle school cliques, right? Like, you're not making a decision about what you want to wear or what you want to do based on what your parents are doing or based on what some kid who's in another group is doing. You're looking at your direct peers to say, how am I supposed to act to fit in? And there's ways in which our sort of like hard wiring and our need to belong keeps us in that state throughout our lives. We grow up a little bit, but we are really susceptible to our perception of what everyone else is thinking and doing. And in a really polarized conflict environment, that means the members of our group, right? Because that's where we can find belonging. That's where we're sort of allowed to be. And so we can think about setting norms the way that I described with Cici Niamani. You build a cross-cutting identity, and through that you set norms and examples, and you bring people that represent multiple different groups together. But you can also look at empowering, we call them in-group moderates, the people who might want to speak out to their own group, to set norms within their group. And this could be a group that's party to the conflict in some way. This could be another group that, like, maybe the conflict is happening along ethnic lines and you can activate people through a religious community, right? This is the case with the Muslim community in Rwanda that by and large did not participate in the genocide and collaborated to rescue victims, right? They activated an existing cross-cutting identity, their Muslim identity, their religious identity, to set norms of rescue and of resistance. So there's different ways that we can think about setting norms, and communication is a core part of how we do that, right? Think about who are the right messengers, how can they get their message out, how can they signal to their broader group. We can also think about building infrastructure for communication. I think when we think about communication, I run into this a lot. It's easy to ask just like, what's the right message to say, right? But so much of this is having the right messengers in place to reach out to different groups and different audiences that might be mobilized in different ways. So we have to ask, who are the different messengers that we're helping prepare and activate and support within a society, and what platforms do they have to reach people and to do so in a way that feels safe to them and possible for them. We can think, and I just talked about this, changing that landscape of social identity, right? In a conflict, you're activating one part of your identity, right? So me personally, I am from Baltimore. I'm an Orioles fan. I'm a sister. I'm a daughter. I'm Jewish. I went to Tufts, so I'm a jumbo. That's like our elephant logo. And so I love playing board games, kind of nerdy, right? So in like a healthy world, I can connect with lots of different people through all of those parts of my identity. But if a conflict is activated along a political line or along religious lines or something like that, right? now there's this one part of my identity that's been activated and keeps me apart from people that don't share it with me. And this is what's happening in conflicts, right? One part of people's social identity is getting activated, made really salient, and it becomes sort of the fault line for a society. So we can also think about building healthy societies where there's multiple social identities that are active and that are connecting people across different divides. And then when you get further downstream towards conflict, right, we can think about interrupting cycles of violence. Things like revenge cycles, where there's an act of violence by one or a couple of people and it's seen as representing the whole group, right, if we're in this polarized space. And now there's this idea of taking revenge against the entire group, right? So you can start to interrupt some of those narratives and those cycles of violence by figuring out how you can use communication to intervene at key moments. And this can feed into sort of early warning and response. How can you use communication to detect tensions early on? Because you'll often hear about a rumor, or you'll hear that people are getting kind of tense and things like that before violence actually happens. And if you can build the communication structures to learn about that and to pay attention to the communication that's going on, well, you can intervene pretty quickly in those cycles. And so those are just a few examples of the types of sort of frames and ideas through which you can use communication to push back. I'm going to make at least one person ask a question before.
It seems like through social media we're creating a lot of isolated echo chambers that are intended to perpetuate precisely the sorts of dysfunction that you're talking about, which leads to these atrocities and genocides. So I'm wondering, you mentioned finding the factors that connect people. Is there a way that you recommend that we find to break into some of these areas?
Yeah, I think that's a really good point, and I think there's a few things going on there, right? One is that through social media, we have a lot more. Let me back up for a second. There's this idea that we're in a dangerous place when people have access to only one source of information, and people have sort of different stories that they're hearing, different ideas of history, different ideas of what's going on, and they're over-reliant on a single source. Maybe only one radio station reaches them, only one newspaper, only one leader, right? So they don't have a diversity of opinions and ideas to sort of get a more nuanced understanding of what's going on. And then that one source has incredible power and influence. And if it starts using this type of speech, right, it's very dangerous. So we look at that with radio in Rwanda and things like that. People have talked about this. And I think what's really interesting about the communication environment that we're in right now is that we have that same sort of dynamic, but it's not because there's only one radio station that reaches us. It's not because of a limited accessibility. It's because we have too much accessibility, right? We can choose between any ideas that we want, right? We can find all the information that we'd want. We can find a whole lot of different really specific stories and lenses on the world, but we can also get ourselves deeply into those. So we're segmented sort of based on trust and preference in terms of media segmentation rather than just accessibility. And I think that's what's new and really interesting about social media is that it's kind of our hardwiring being hacked to keep feeding us stuff that's interesting to us, and it's pushing us further and further sort of into these echo chambers. And I think what's really interesting is there's often this idea that you have to go towards it head on to combat it. Like, we're going to break down these echo chambers by providing people other types of news, right? We're going to provide a go look at both sides of a story, right? Go read this source and that source. And that's really great for people that are motivated to break themselves out of an echo chamber, but it's not really great for someone that doesn't care or someone that's actually really committed to the point of view and the perspective that's sort of within their echo chamber that they already have. And so I think what's really important to think about there is, like, how can you also tackle the problem sideways, right? So when we talk about diversifying the sort of landscape of social identity, that might not mean going in directly with the political opinion or on the particular topic, right? That means creating, if you think of it as like a Venn diagram where we're totally separate, well, what are the things that overlap? Is it like gardening? Is it art? Is it like travel, right? What are the different types of communities that you can create that start to bring people together? So you're not breaking into the existing echo chamber, you're just creating more circles and more spaces. And it's through the trust and the relationships that you're going to get people to listen to and think about another opinion. And you do want to expose people to different ideas, but I think breaking into the echo chamber, it's not that head on, I'm going to break in to your echo chamber through the topic that we're divided on. It's, I'm going to try and get to know you or find a connection or something that we relate about. And I think that if you think about a healthy social media landscape, you're going to have more interconnections like that, and people are going to naturally then be exposed to more information. Easier, much easier said than done. Any other questions? I know I said I would only force one, but if you have others, I would
love to pause. For the us-them distinction, is just from a theory point of view, is it the goal to transcend that or to construct the us-them in a way that existential threats or the type of language is not used or that violence is not seen as plausible?
Okay, yeah, no, that's a great, let me start with a really silly question. Raise your hand if you love cats. Raise your hand if you love dogs. Raise your hands if you love neither. Oh, wow. Okay. So I don't know, I've never actually asked that last question. That's interesting. Do you love an animal, like lizards or something? So like, if you love cats, can you also love dogs? Can you also?
Always say they can, but
Okay. Max has the unhealthy version of us and them. Right, so being in one group doesn't preclude you from being in the other group, right? And if you don't like either, can you still be friends with someone that loves dogs or cats or both? Like, well, we know who's going into conflict if there's a dog lovers versus cat lovers tensions break out. This is a silly point, but really the point here is that we all have different parts of like preferences and things about us and these things that become part of our social identity. Like if you're a hardcore dog lover and you're part of like a bunch of groups that share dog pictures and you volunteer at the dog shelter and things like that. Same with cats, that might be a really important part of your identity, but it's not an identity that's being activated in conflict. It's not an identity that's under threat. No one's come and said we want to round up all the cat lovers, right? And if they did, you might feel that identity to be a lot more salient than you do right now. We tend to feel an identity as really salient when it comes under attack, when it comes under threat. We sort of solidify the boundaries of the us and we start to create new others. But there are benign versions of us and them all the time, and they're really important because we're really social beings. We need to belong. We're hardwired to belong. We will not survive alone in the wild by ourselves, right? We survive, and I think I have like a day, if I'm lucky, right? If you leave me out on my own in the world. Like we need other people. We need to belong in groups. And doing that, you create an us. And you create an us and a them, but it doesn't have to be threatening or negative. It can be a pretty benign us and them, like that cat versus dog thing, or like my grandmother who recently moved to Baltimore, and she's always like knitted, but now it's like this huge part of her identity because it's how she found belonging, is at this one knitting store, yarn store, where she knits with her friends and really finds a sense of community and belonging, and she talks about it a lot, and now it's a really big part of how she sees herself. So different parts of our identity become more or less salient and important to us at different moments. But this threat factor is what becomes problematic, right? When suddenly the dog lovers are a threat and you're not allowed to be both. You kind of have to choose a side. And that's kind of a silly example, but you can think about it, right? If tomorrow suddenly everyone was slandering this university or upstate New York or from maybe Maryland, like in the news, you're going to feel that identity more keenly. You're going to be like, why are they attacking us? We have to band together. And this is how we're wired, that when there's a threat, and this is how that us and them dynamic plays off of each other. When they're a threat, we have to protect us, right? And so we start to feel like a bigger sense of belonging to our own group and a bigger pressure to act on behalf of our group. So I don't think you can or should transcend the idea of us and them, because that's group and belonging. But I think we have to ask, what does that look like in a healthy society? In a healthy society, being in a group doesn't preclude you from being in the other. You can access all the different parts of your social identity and find belonging and connection with different people. And certainly the problem comes when another group is seen as a threat, and when they're seen as essential, when they're seen as sort of all the same. So I hope that sort of gets at your question. I think we have to ask, what does a healthy landscape look like in terms of our social identities? Anybody else have a question? Yeah?
Is there and this may be a really stupid question, so I will
No stupid questions. There are no such things.
brace yourself. But
Try and prove me wrong.
So I noticed that a lot of current identity factors are being characterized as under threat that just really aren't. I think in particular things like men's rights activists. I think of the white supremacist organizations that talk about how white folks are under threat, and those of course aren't real. These are organizations that are trying to undo equitable organizations and trying to perpetuate the type of violence that you're talking to us about. And when it comes to engaging them, it seems like logic and reason have no place in their conversations.
Yeah, I mean, it doesn't have to be a real threat. You just have to think you're under threat or think you might be under threat, right? Like if I tell you somebody's coming to get you, somebody's coming to attack you, you might think there's a very small chance that that's correct. But you might act as if it is, just in case, right? We're really sensitive to threat. We're overly sensitive to threat. If I'm walking through the forest and I see sometimes I put up a picture of a stick that looks a little bit like you look at it first, you're like, oh my God, it's a snake, right? Like I am way more likely to see a stick and think it's a snake and react accordingly than I am to see a snake and be like, oh, that's a stick, I'm gonna kick it, right? Like we're very wired, and like that's like an environmental threat. Like we're really hardwired to be extra sensitive and overreactive to threats. And the problem, and we learn about them, right? I've done some of these like trainings and talks to, one of my favorite examples of this was with like a group of middle schoolers, and I was asking them about like something that they were, a time that to think about it, and maybe everybody actually do this now, because I think it's helpful for myself too. If you think about a time that you felt scared, but the thing you were scared of wasn't real, and you can even think about when you were little. I'll give you the example that I'm thinking of, but does anybody have an example that you're thinking of? Yeah. The monster under your bed, of course. So when you thought there was a monster under your bed, what did you do? Yeah, right? You're like, I'm going to stay here. I don't care if I have to pee. I don't care if like anything, like, right? Like I'm not moving. The monster might be there. I might have checked before I went to bed and seen that there's no monster there. I might have been told rationally that there's no monster there. But like, no way am I going to trust that, because like, what if, right? What if on that small chance? And probably you thought that there's a monster under your bed because of some stories you heard or some ideas that came to you, right? Like we can create this sense of threat and fear because we don't have to see somebody else. We don't have to ourselves experience a bad thing. I don't have to myself get burned to know that I shouldn't stick a limb into a fire if I see somebody else, or if I see a story, or if I'm told about it, right? This is generally really good for our survival. It's really problematic when we start to paint other people as threats, right? But stories, media, all of these things really matter. The example I was thinking about is kind of similar, but a little bit different, is that several young students raised their hand and said that they had been really afraid of butterflies as kids, because there was apparently like a really bad butterfly on SpongeBob. And so they'd seen this like really bad butterfly and were like terrified of butterflies. And it's so funny because like we can all laugh and like a butterfly is not something to be afraid of, right? But they had seen a story, and so they learned this feeling of fear. And these are all really simple examples, and it gets a lot more complicated when we take it into this context of intergroup threat. But the point of all of that is just to say it's really easy to create the perception of a threat. All you have to do is plant that seed of maybe, that seed of doubt, and we're so activated around it. And so these are really powerful, really dangerous narratives, and it's that much harder to counteract them because you can't just reason with somebody, right? You can't just tell them that's not true, you shouldn't believe it. Once that threat kicks in, all these other dynamics kick in, right? If my group's under threat, I feel more attached to my group. Well, now the social pressure within my group becomes more and more. So there's not an easy solution to that, but it's really important that we recognize that that's what's being manipulated and that's what's going on. And it doesn't have to be a real threat. It can be a story of a threat. It can be a perceived threat, and that's extraordinarily powerful.
Any other questions? Yeah.
I'm fascinated by this story of developing a text messaging platform in 08 and 09. I just can imagine, these days we're so accustomed to this. There are app stores and there are just communities that produce that fairly easily. It became ubiquitous. But back then, I'm just curious, how did you develop the technology? Who maintained the technology? Were there bugs? How did you convince people to put it on their device?
There's the long version of this story. I'll try hard to give you the short one, right? So I mean, in 2007, 2008, during the post-election violence, it was really like at that time, people had cell phones, and I always use the analogy of like when I was younger, you would have chain letters or chain emails that you had to copy and send to a list of 10 people. Otherwise, all the horrible things were going to happen to you. You'll be alone forever. No one will love you. Your life will suck, right? And so, like, that's literally the type of messages that were being sent around. Like, here's a quote. You have to send it to 5 people, and you'll have good luck today, right? And so people were used to this behavior of forwarding on text messages. But when the text message that comes is like, they're going to kick us out of our houses if they win the election, right? They didn't have to build a platform to use text messages for violence, right? Because it's tapping into that fear and that threat. And so people were spreading messages. People were using it for coordination, right? They were able to leverage that technology without a lot of planning. Now, to leverage it on the other hand, we had to get ahead of the game, right? To get ahead of the fear mongering, the rumors, we had to actually build the infrastructure and get people to subscribe. And to do that, we went through like 4 or 5 iterations of the platform itself. It started with this technology called frontline SMS. had a little computer like this size, but like the 2010 version of it, and a modem that you would plug in that had a SIM card in it with a phone number, and then you had Frontline SMS is a technology, like a software that people could text in, and you would see the text message pop up on the computer. And that was a big thing, and I didn't know how to set it up. Somebody had to help me set it up. Then we got a lot of subscribers. Once we had a couple of thousand subscribers, that was way too slow. It was like sending it out like if you have really bad service and you're trying to text someone, but like to 2,000 people, like that was not a fast way to reach a lot of people. So then got this like software developer to work for us for free, and there was a ton of bugs in the platform that he built for us and helped us use with a short code, which let messages send a lot faster. And we worked on that for a while, and then we ended up working with this Prague Help Foundation from South Africa, which had developed these messaging platforms, and they're developing a new one, and we got in as their like beta user. So they built a lot of different functionalities for us that let us do things like have an extra security layer, which was basically like two-factor authentication. But back then it was like you had to build a whole thing for it, where like you would type in the password or you would press send on a message, and first then you'd have to get a message on your phone and like respond yes to it in order for the message to go out. So yeah, it was building this really clunky thing that I think you could probably just like do on your desktop now.
Yeah. What kind of messages were you guys sending over?
So we had a lot of different categories of messages. We had some proactive messaging, which was civic education. We built out a civic education curriculum where we sort of looked at where there might be potential rumors and misinformation, because there was a new constitution and a lot of things were changing. Like you were voting for 6 elected positions rather than 3, so there were 3 new positions. Some had changed. People were voting. People had to register to vote with like their biometric data, and some people were expecting electronic voting, but it was paper voting on 6 separate ballots. People thought because they registered biometrically, you could vote from anywhere. You still had to go vote in your area. So we did a lot of just proactively educating people so that you would avoid the type of conflict that comes from somebody getting turned away from a polling station and thinking it's because of the group that they're from, but so that people could also know when something really was going wrong and when it wasn't. We did a lot of civic engagement messaging, so we did things like inviting people to the political debates. We did things like inviting people to land forums in areas where land conflict was an issue, and telling them when it was going to be rebroadcast on the radio. We did things that were just like useful to people because we had the capacity to reach them. So guess what? Bursary funds are being dispersed in this community this week. You all have a right to access them. This is how, right? Because it was building that trust and relationship. And then we really monitored what was going on in different communities, because everywhere where we had subscribers, we had a team of maybe like 20 people going door to door. And they were a team of people that came from all different tribes, political parties, religions, ages, genders, et cetera. And so they had an eye into different parts of the community. And the team that led that sort of expansion into new areas was the original teams that started it in their own neighborhoods. And so they sort of formed the top of a phone tree where they were each coordinating with a particular area. And they would say like, you know what, there are some tensions in this area. People are starting to talk separately when they go to the butcher to buy meat, and they're not speaking in the same language. And so we're hearing from our partners there that it would be good to send out some sort of message that just reminds people that they're going to keep peace and that elections won't divide us. Or there's a rumor that's starting to spread here. We need to remind people to ask a question before a rumor. So we did a lot of things that kind of asked people to stop and think about their actions, and also promoted this positive norm that you could expect that other people around you were not going to be violent, or were going to resolve their grievances in a more positive way, or we're going to ask a question before spreading a rumor and be really responsible in that way. And we heard from subscribers that it made them feel more comfortable speaking out against violence, or telling their friends maybe we should, when there was actually some tensions around the election, guys, maybe we shouldn't go out now and like get our weapons. Maybe we should just wait and like see what happens over the next 6 hours or so. Let's just wait. I just got a message. It sounds like maybe there's something happened. Maybe someone's watching what we're doing. So we sent a lot of different messages, and we built them by doing focus groups in different communities with different people. So we did focus groups with people who had participated in the 2007-2008 post-election violence, and we looked at the types of the pathways to violence that they had taken, and we asked, what would you say to a friend if they were here, if their friends are gathering on a street corner and saying, like, let's arm themselves? How would you give someone an out? What would you want them to do? Make an excuse and go home? Well, what would you send them to make that possible for them? So, and we with people who are information spreaders or influencers, what would you tell a friend to get them not to think twice before they would share this type of rumor with their community? So we built the messages in that way. Yeah.
Can you talk a little bit about the work that you're doing in the United States and also how you measure effectiveness of your programs?
Yeah.
The classic problem of measuring prevention.
Right, measuring prevention is really, really hard. And it's one of the reasons I wanted to start Over Zero. Is that I was frustrated by the lack of ability. I mean, we were able to measure impact in Kenya by surveying subscribers, both on text message at like a pretty large scale, like 7,300 people, and then calling a few hundred people and interviewing them. But that's a subscriber feedback. That's still, you still don't know if you actually prevented violence or not. It's really hard to know that something didn't happen. I'll start with actually the measurement thing. So for Over Zero, I mentioned that a lot of the work we do is like training, giving people toolkits, helping people design interventions and pilot and test them. So we do a lot of work sort of beta testing ideas and working with interdisciplinary researchers to design ways of how they would measure the impact. And it's not just, did you prevent violence? Because we're a lot further upstream. We're measuring things like shifts in norm perceptions. Like, do you think most people in your group support this? So we're working with people from anthropology and social psychology, marketing and sociology and all of this to design different ways to test different types of interventions and see what the type of impact is that they're having. But we're doing it at a very small scale, and you're measuring sort of an interim impact between where we're at now and what it would look like to, like the variables that we know are associated with increasing risk. Our work in the United States, we work a lot to train and build capacity for civil society groups that are trying to understand what they're seeing and give them an additional lens of looking at it not just through a partisan lens, not through a US is exceptional lens, but looking at the dynamics of intergroup conflict. We'll do like deep dives into understanding social identity, understanding empathy and when it can be used for pro-social behavior, but how it can be manipulated and used to mobilize people for violence. We look at all those different factors and dynamics that tend to be at play under the surface and how this speech manipulates societies, and then we talk about in a lot greater depth, right? Basically the little mini teaser that I just gave you, right? What are the different things that we know about the types of interventions that can be effective, and how would you build them? So we have also a lot of design tools for thinking about the audiences you want to reach and what are the right messengers and channels and content to reach them with. So we do a lot of that sort of design support. We do some strategic advising to larger initiatives and programs. And we do, in the US especially, we just put out a paper on resilience to political violence in the US that kind of takes a step back and says, what if we analyzed the US and looked at it the way we would look at any other country and asked, what are the risk factors? How are we doing? What are the things that we know are risk factors for violence and instability that we see having a negative trend line? And so we really we put that out, and that falls in the category of like helping advance thinking within the field. And with that, we've really tried to engage groups that have the potential to sort of throw their hat in the ring and say, like, I care about this issue and I want to act on it. It's not just about partisan political fighting. It's actually about who we are as a society and what type of, whether we're going to enable further identity-based violence and whether we can recognize these risks. So it's a lot of education and training and support, capacity support, but also the support to do the evaluation piece that we end up focusing on. Yes?
During your work in Kenya, when you initially gained scale, have you faced any sort of organized attempts to sabotage or undermine or stop you in the tracks? And in which forms, if yes, in which forms was it?
I mean, the short answer, the long answer is way more interesting than that, I think. I think that, and I talked about this at some point during this visit, but I think Kenya was in a really particular place in that 2007, 2008 was really shocking for a lot of people, right? The violence that was experienced was not a norm. It wasn't like a state that people had become accustomed to. It was really a surprise. And people really paid, right? Like people, their communities were destroyed. Like young people, even those who like participated in violence, they were like, we can't hang out in like the places where we used to hang out. They're not there anymore. It's too dangerous to go. Even the people that participated in violence generally like didn't get paid what they were promised because it was pretty organized in a lot of ways. And even if they did get paid, the cost of living went up so much, like things like airtime during that long period of the violence, that it didn't really make a difference to them. And then they were kind of like shunned by the community afterwards. So people really didn't want violence again. They might still have the same grievances. They might still really want their political leader to win. But people had really very recently experienced the cost of violence, and so there was a pretty widespread investment from communities and from people and not wanting to see it happen again. And there was also some sort of more macro level incentives for politicians. There had been International Criminal Court had brought charges of crimes against humanity against 2 leading politicians who then allied for violence that they had incited and organized sort of against each other and against the groups that they were that they were mobilizing. So they actually allied together on one ticket for the election, saying that there was sort of like the West was out to get them. And so you had 2 previously sort of like opposing leaders now allied together because they'd both been charged, and you had an opposition leader who didn't want his name to go on that list, right? So you had a lot of high level incentives as well. And so we really didn't get much of that, and I think that's really unusual, right? Like other places where I've been, one of the biggest challenges to building this type of programming is it's really hard to find messengers. Like for us, there was so much investment, and you could find people that were like the most hardcore supporters of different politicians. They were going door to door for the politicians too, but they were like, I'm gonna support my politician, I'm gonna be really mad if he or she doesn't win, but I'm not gonna let it get to the point of violence. So we were able to build that type of coalition, and there was that desire there. When I went to Myanmar in like 2015, working with some local activists, the hardest thing is that you couldn't find messengers, right, across the spectrum. You had peace activists, and it was very hard to find messengers or people that wanted to speak out outside of that, right? And so, and in the U.S., right, I think you're seeing that shift over the last couple of years when we started to see this type of speech become more normalized and accepted in our public discourse than in very recent years, right? People were like, that's not nice, I don't like that, and people were concerned, but I think I've seen it get more and more that people understand what the stakes might be, right? And that it's not just that we don't like it, it's bad, but like it might be worth it to expend social capital or take a risk for myself as somebody with power or with a voice that people listen to or whatever it might be to say and do something about this. So it was really interesting for me to think about Kenya was like, it was really unique that you could find all these different stakeholders that wanted to come together around it. But it's often really scary for people to speak out for peace. And during the 07-08 post-election violence in Kenya, it was too, right? For these local peace activists I worked with, peace was not an easy choice. It was a really dangerous and scary choice for them, right, to try and promote it. And that's often the case when you get further downstream. But I think what I've noticed there, and I think is really interesting, is like further upstream, it's also like, it's scary always to stick your neck out against like what your group is doing, but I don't think there's a recognition of, it's hard to recognize the stakes until you're pretty far down the rabbit hole. Okay, we'll go here and here.
Let's, they can go first.
Okay. I think it was, did I see a missing hand over here from somebody that had? Okay.
How do you identify the influencers that you were talking about? Because, yeah, just sat there.
That was my question.
So this was working with, I didn't, is the easy answer, right? It was the people that were living in their own communities that would map out the influencers and how information spread, right? So they're the ones that identified that like a bartender is a really important source of information in their community, or that in their really rural area there are market days like once a week where people are coming together from all over and rumors spread really fast. So you might want to be really prepared in market days, and you might want to do your outreach at the market days. So you get all the people that are coming to the marketplace, but you also get all the vendors there because they're moving around and they're going to have a bigger impact, right? So this isn't like, and you saw like the woman you saw the picture of the woman who owns a kiosk, right? Like these are the types of influencers. You can't know that if you don't live somewhere and if you don't know a community and a society. And it was really different in like an urban area versus a rural area and across different places. So it was really actually about everyone creating it together. And so the way that when we like expanded into new areas, the teams that had set it up in their own community would go and be the one to facilitate, okay, how are you going to make your outreach plan? This is what we did here. Who are the key influencers in your community? What are the places where you see a lot of people come together throughout the day? And it was really casual places too. Like there's places where people who are looking for day labor, casual laborers like hang out. There's the place where like young unemployed guys sit around and smoke weed, whatever that might be, right? Like you want to target those places because they really matter. And like there's people sitting around reading a newspaper all day and talking about it. But you wouldn't necessarily think about it through like a very formalized approach. It was a lot about informal influencers and leaders and figuring out how to bring them on board. And again, it's about thinking, what is this ecosystem of communication? I always, like one of the first questions we'll ask when analyzing this is, how does a rumor spread in your community? How do people gossip, right? That's really important information if you want to think about the information that flows around a conflict, but it's not necessarily the typical actors that you would think about as like key conflict stakeholders.
I don't want to distract you from the main focus, but I would imagine that there are people in this room who are thinking about you finishing an undergraduate degree and going to Kenya, not having a job lined up. I don't know, did you speak Kiswahili before?
It was
you
some
went?
Kiswahili, yeah.
Okay.
I studied abroad. I studied abroad.
Kind of advice to people about, what you wish you knew when you went there, what you see as the advantages of having done it that way rather than something more traditional.
Yeah. I think like for that, it kind of is like your preferences. I really wanted to try something, and I had been to Kenya, I had studied abroad there, so it was not a brand new place for me, and I was really interested. I was going sort of with a purpose or an issue that I cared about. I think that like the thing I feel really lucky about is that I had no idea what I was doing, but I was also like, I knew that I didn't know what I was doing, right? Like I wasn't so nailed down to one approach or one process or one project, and it changed a lot, right? The first 6 months I was there of like meeting people, the initial idea I went in with was nothing like what we came out with CC Niamani, right? And so I think that like if we're gonna go work somewhere else or really anywhere, right? It's like knowing that you don't know everything, being willing to be challenged and question your own assumptions and adapt something, and like keep in mind the purpose of having the impact that you want to have, rather than like building a thing or having yourself be in a certain position. And I think that those are the things that made CC Niamani sort of end up working out. And I got really lucky because I met really amazing people that were doing awesome work in their communities, and they sort of let me be part of it and work with them. But I think like the biggest thing I think for me is that I tended to always really care about something or be bothered by something, and I think if you do the thing that really bothers you, like that you're really bothered about and that like you can't stop thinking about, or that really excites you, like if you find that, then I think you sort of you figure it and you commit to it, and you reflect as you go, then you kind of decide that you're going to figure it out. So I don't know, I think I'm kind of weird in that way, in that I definitely didn't have a career path set out for myself, and I couldn't have told, like I went to Kenya for 3 to 6 months. When I first went. That was what I said. And that was what I thought. I don't think I would have been brave to say that I was going to move there for 4 years. I don't think I could do that even now. I was making a 3 to 6 month commitment, and then I was going to stay for 6 more months. But I got so invested in this thing that I stayed for a lot longer. So I guess it's also just like, I think it's important to be open. I think it's also important to stay in touch with yourself. Like that's something I would say I've found to be important and worked on a lot throughout the years. Like that if you are really passionate and care a lot about something, it's easy to get swept away in that and sometimes lose touch with other parts of yourself that you need to take care of and have balance and also grow and pay some attention to. So I think I think that the like internal journey of like self-awareness and checking in with yourself and asking, is this what I want to be doing? What's really exciting to me? What's really motivating and bringing energy to me right now, and what's not? If you keep asking yourself that, you'll keep finding your way towards something that's more and more of a fit. But who knows?
I think if I understand you correctly, you've been talking about the ordinary citizens in Kenya. Okay, so this is such a thought that, for example, there's many different highly divided come from Ethiopia. So, so I'm sure you know about that place. There's been this genocide, and so violence is just the way to go. So the problem is there's the producers of this hate mongering, and it's dangerous narratives, very influential people. I mean, ordinary citizens, young people, and others, I think consumers. And then I see there's a lot of feedback when these people, and so we, as a politician, push this very, very dangerous and irresponsible rhetoric, and then turning one group against another, that's appealing to historical injustices, really deceit. There is the people understanding it in a certain way, but even when they try, I'm not sure if these elite try and change things, they'll be able to do that easily, because there's feedback that I see as the people, the young people, will not be able to understand the shift in rhetoric. So there's these dangers. So I was wondering if you have worked with thought about as the elite and the producers of these tape or something?
Yeah, I mean, most of my work has been done more on like the sort of citizen level, but I think that because it's a feedback loop, you can figure out where are the points within it that you can intervene. And it's usually like in a place where there's really entrenched divisions. It's not a fast process. Like I mentioned our political debates program in Kenya, and that was looking at that feedback loop, right? That was saying that like in campaign season, citizens were very much consumers, right? A campaign rally happens because like the way it happens is that you get paid to show up, you get mobilized by the most local representative of that particular political party. They pay you, they maybe give you alcohol, you show up, you cheer, you show that you've shown up, and then you go home. There's no questioning. There's no like, we care about this policy, and I realize that who we elect, my neighbor and I are both going to hold them accountable for something, right? And even if you do that, there's no guarantee it's going to work out with the politician that you elect, right? Because they're going to go and they have all the incentive in the world to just keep stealing money or whatever it is. But we started the political debates with like a really basic goal, and it wasn't that it was going to change anyone's vote and that they were going to vote for the person that said the best policy. We actually didn't really think that that was possible because there had not been a role model of having that be done, of electing a leader and they actually did something about a policy. But we wanted people to have the experience of sitting next to somebody that they thought that they had completely opposing political views to and realize that they had one thing in common, and that maybe no matter who won, they're going to try and get them to do this one thing that's going to benefit both of them, right? So it was saying that if the competition is on like money, getting paid to show up, and if it's on tribe, who your leader is, we wanted to just like at least inject this idea that maybe there's also this other thing, right? Like policies or programs that has to do with it. But I think that that type of change, when there's that feedback loop and when there's that mobilization of people and that relationship between elite and masses, you have to, it's not going to happen overnight. It's going to happen really, really slowly because even if you change the one side, it's going to take a while for the other side to catch up. But I think if you want to change on the consumer side, it's tempting to just say you have to only change what the elite are saying. But this is where I think those like local networks, like if you want to intervene on the citizen level, it's much more complex than just like the masses or just like the young people, right? We can ask who are those informal influencers, and it doesn't have to be about politics. It can be about other things too. So I think it's also possible to think about a little more structure around communication flow and influence and find various pathways to intervene. But I don't think it's an easy problem to solve at all. I don't think there's just one answer. I really also think that context really, really matters. It matters what the governance structure is. It matters how free and open is the democracy versus how much authoritarianism is there, right? Like all of these things are gonna really impact and influence like how extensive is the history of violence? How recent was it? All of that is going to influence what's possible and what's not possible in a given moment. And what you have to, I think it's about asking like, are there some inroads? And I think with communication people, sometimes there are inroads that you can't find if you look at it from another angle of like, we're going to change the policies or this or that. If you look at the communication, you have the informal channels that you can try when other channels are blocked.
Oh, yes. Can you tell us a little bit more about what makes an informal influencer?
It's a good question. I mean, when we do like design workshops, we just work with community members to identify this, and we ask them about communication flows, and we ask like, who are key sources of information? And we ask things like, how does a rumor spread? How did this piece of information spread? Who are all the people that it hit along the way, and like, who are the people where it helped bring it out to more people? We ask, where do people go? And we're just trying to get all the possible starting points, right? We're not saying who's the biggest and the best influencer. We're getting people to think about the world of people that they could influence. So we ask things like, think about the audience you want to reach. Where do they go if they need help? Where do they go to find out if something that they heard is true or not? Where do they go when they're struggling with a decision about their family? Where do they go if they're struggling with a decision about their work? Where do they go to learn about like what happened in the neighborhood, right? Or like somebody having an affair, whatever it might be. Like we find out all the different ways that people access information, and it gives us the world of possible people that you could reach. And then you start to ask, well, what is the reach of each of these influencers? And it's not just like how much of an influencer are they, it's also to whom, right? Are they reaching a group that we're otherwise struggling to reach? Are we, by this combination of influencers, able to reach a lot of different pockets in a society? So that's sort of in like the design approach, that's the way that we tend to think about it. And who do people defer to in a room when you're having a conversation, or who we'll think about influencers where who's somebody that speaks infrequently but to a lot of people, right? Like that's a celebrity or something. Who's somebody that speaks really regularly to a fair amount of people, right? Maybe a local religious leader who speaks to people once a week, or the bartender, right? So you can look at sort of those that aspect of like how often is someone talking to people and how many people are they reaching.
How do you make some of these ideas accessible to those who may not necessarily be educated on the idea? So I know that some of the influencers that you're going to be talking to may not necessarily, they're not going to have PhDs because they're just folks in the neighborhood. And how do you convince them to get on board with this and to destabilize these dysfunctional structures of information?
I generally don't. I work with people that want to do that in their communities, and they're the ones that find the inroads, right? Like, I think that's the other important thing. And I guess, right, I've played different roles at different times. It was different with CC Niamani when we were actually an implementer, right? But still, it was very rarely me, right? I was working with a core team of people to design the programming and set it up, but they were the ones going out into the community. I was not the right person. I spoke Swahili. I didn't speak any of the mother tongues. People didn't know my face in the different communities, right? I didn't know what the different incentives were or where the influencers were in a neighborhood in Nairobi or in rural Rift Valley. And I think that's the other thing, like realizing like where's your leverage, right? Like where are you adding the most value and where are you not adding value, right? Like where is it not helpful for you to show up and it's way more helpful for you to give somebody else what they need to do it. So like in Kenya, for example, going out and doing the subscription, I never ever went out and asked people to subscribe to our platform. I was not the person that anyone wanted or needed to hear from, right? That was teams of people, and even we had people from one neighborhood in Nairobi who were helping bring the outreach to the next neighborhood. They'd gotten contacted by their peers, by other organizations who were like, we want to see this here. Well, they went and they helped them, right? And then they would mobilize who are the people that are known and that have social capital in this community to go and talk to people and reach out to them. So I think that's the one thing. And I think when it depends at what level you're working, right? So if you're actually doing the implementation, it's about understanding that context or that community. When we're doing, I think part of the point of doing a lot of this design process is that there's lots of kind of more fancy knowledge about fear and threat and things like that, and you can share that with people. And there's certain audiences, maybe among more like elite sort of leader levels, like we end up doing that a lot in the US when we're trying to get people who are influential and maybe they're like a big religious leader, they're very educated, and they want to engage with this stuff at the very intellectual level. We'll do the deep dive of all the theory with them. But when we're working with people, like the most important knowledge here for actually setting up, if you want to look at the Kenyan example, the most important knowledge is knowing your community really, really well, right? And the biggest thing that I could offer is to say, here's an exercise. Let's map out a rumor. But I'm not the one filling in that exercise. And like drawing arrows and drawing out how a rumor spreads, it's not something I could do if I don't know that community really well. So I think it's also about not just privileging the PhD level knowledge and saying like that's the thing that's most important. It can be helpful, and it can be helpful if we want to consolidate and like think about how learnings and interventions between different areas can speak to each other. But at the level of you're actually designing something, you want the person that knows that community best. And I think it's really, I'm going on and on, but I actually think this is really, really important. I think that when we think about the type of knowledge and expertise that's valuable, we're often not thinking about that knowledge of this is how my community works. This is how I've seen it happen before. This is what I know about how information flows in my community. This is what I know about the grievances. And this is what I know about the history of my community and who's influential and all of that, right? We tend to say that that's sort of less good knowledge or less specialized knowledge. That's really, really specialized, important knowledge. And I don't think you can be successful at this type of work in a particular community without doing it. And it's been different to do this work in the US where for some of our work with Over Zero, we've been taking a sector-based approach, or like a approach where you go within a particular community, whether it's within an activist community or within a faith community. And it's about combining the knowledge that we have with the knowledge that someone has about the space that they're operating in. That's not a neighborhood, but it's still a structure and a world that very contextual knowledge matters so much. So, yes, and then so 1, 2.
I wonder if you have you've had these issues of trust within the communities. I assume that in Kenya, I don't know much about that. different ethnic groups within different communities, and one community in different communities. So I was thinking, so okay, peace is one thing. So I understand that the community or the communities have general interest, common interest in peace. But there's also this politics and elections, and then the people that we're working with are support different political parties and from different ethnic groups, which means or which implies that one party leading could mean that the other party that's supporting of another party could be evicted or was threatened in some way. So didn't that have a problem with trust when you try to?
Yeah, and we would see like threats and evictions and all of that as part of the world of targeted violence, right? It doesn't just have to be the most extensive form of violence with a weapon. It can be kick somebody out and things like that. Trust is a huge issue. And like I said, Kenya was kind of unique in that you had people that like really strongly disagreed and like felt these big divisions, but were commonly committed to not having violence again. But there was still a fair level of conflict. They still really disagreed with each other. I think that's also an important distinction. First of all, I think when the commitment to not being violent, right, that included things like what you're talking about, right? You're bringing people together to say these are the things that we're not going to do around these elections and the ways that we're not going to be divided. But I think that I think there's also another important point there, which is distinguishing between conflict and violence. Because you can have a whole lot of conflict without there being violence, and violence tends to create a whole lot of harm and more reason for long-term grievances, revenge, and things like that. It can make problems a lot worse, right? And it tends to harm the people that are involved in various ways, including perpetrators, right, who face long-term effects from their participation. But conflict is healthy in a society. It's about how it gets managed. And so I also think that it's really important to not try and eliminate all conflict by creating peace, not try and have this pacification that tells people, shut up, go home, accept the way things are, right? Like, you don't want to close the space for people to work on issues around justice, on issues around the grievances that matter to them, because that you just put things under the surface until there's a moment for it to bubble up and you leave really long-standing harm and issues. So the question is, how do you prevent the harm of violence while leaving open the space for grievances? And we dealt with that a lot in Kenya, asking like where people had grievances. We didn't want to send messages that told them to stop caring about their grievances or to give up on the things that mattered to them. We wanted to help them think about how they could channel it in a different way. But that's come up. I've been in a few conversations about like polarization, for example, in the US, and this idea of like, how do we get rid of polarization or reduce polarization? And someone pointed out, well, if you want like a Facebook or a platform, whatever it is, with no polarization, what you really need is like an authoritarian regime that's censoring everyone. If we have no polarization, it means we're not disagreeing with each other, and that's also super unhealthy, right? It's about the type of disagreement, and there it's also, and I would say it's the same thing with like these like divisions based on tribe or ethnic group or whatever it is. This idea that your group is inherently and completely different from my group. We have no common grievances. We have no common issue that we share, like a lack of political accountability from whoever is elected, right? It's your group is to blame for my problem. So it's also shifting the frame of that grievance from it being against an entire group that's seen as one entity that shares an essence and is all culpable, right? Versus starting to see, like, to find different ways to see and address those grievances. So I say it those two things, enabling conflict to continue to exist and polarization to continue to exist without getting very toxic and unhealthy and identity-based or turning into violence. You had a hand up.
I just had a couple of questions. So I was kind of wondering if you could talk a little bit more how you started Over Zero and how you picked your team, and also how you took your experience from Kenya and you altered that with this project, or if you did alter, if there was any changes you made.
Yeah, I mean, Over Zero is really different, again, in that we're not an implementer, but we are trying to support people that are doing the implementation. And it would be like a long-term dream for me to be able to go back to Kenya, to that region, to work with old colleagues. I still keep in touch with them and figure out, because I think that I walked away from CC Niamani feeling like the thing that I had to offer was to provide some tools to take the knowledge and the social capital and the commitment that, that this group had and be able to get the resources behind it and to be able to help them build it into a strategy and then take that out into their communities. And I wanted to start something that could really do that at a bigger scale and also advocate for the larger institutions that provide support to be able to support initiatives like that and to support the actual work of designing interventions and also to support the learning. Like I said, I really think there's a lot of learning that needs to be done so that we can get better at this stuff. But I had a gap between Kenya and starting Over Zero. I did consulting for a little while. I saw a lot of different organizations. And in Kenya, I think to some degree, like none of us ever really know what we're doing. And it's good to recognize that. We're always figuring it out, and we always should be figuring it out and trying to get better. But I really didn't know what I was doing when I finished undergrad and went to Kenya. And again, I got really lucky because I was surrounded by really good people. But figuring out how to build a team, it was a scrappy group, like all volunteers. And eventually I was able to get the funds to pay people and build out and so that we actually had a full paid staff and things like that. Whereas with Over Zero, I was lucky to have a lot more support from the get-go and get to actually go out and hire people and do a whole hiring process. So that was something that I learned for the first time with Over Zero that had not really happened for the most part with CC Niamani, because it was people were committed and then we got the resources. So there's a way that it was a really different experience in terms of just how the organization came together, but it's also a really different organization in the role that we're playing in terms of providing tools and resources and kind of advocating around these issues. And I think for me, it was the experience in Kenya and then seeing a lot of other organizations to ask, what's the type of thing that I want to build? I don't want it to be big and bureaucratic. I want us to be flexible and adaptive. I want us to work with a ton of partners, right? I want us to be a very collaborative organization. I wanted us to really respect the type of knowledge and insights and work that I was just talking about, right? Of people that really know their communities well. And so I hope that answers your question at least a little bit.
Yeah.
So quick question for you. I think I don't know when it really happened, but when it turned to the point where the us and them, in terms of like the United States, for example, people having different points of view, like say the Democratic Party, Republican Party, and people not being able to have actual conversations because now, well, you have a different view. I can't talk to you because now I have to have some sort of hatred to you because of. When did that kind of happen where people can't have a conversation just because they have different viewpoints? You know what I mean? Things just get escalate, even on like some of the smallest issues. Is it just because of the political atmosphere that we're currently finding ourselves in, or like when did it become where you can't have even like a small conversation, like in a logical form? I guess with logic, I guess. I mean, how do you deal with that when you can't get people to just have a conversation?
So I don't think I can answer when that happened, but I think I can. Where I might be able to be helpful is some thinking around what is it that's actually going on. So there's a lot of research actually, right, that's been done in the US that looks at polarization over time. And what it shows is that I think what's important is that it's not just that the polarization is more. It's not that we actually like disagree a whole lot more on issues. It's that sort of qualitatively the type of polarization is really different. It's the type of polarization that it's identity-based, it's not issue-based. I mean, it's both, but it's more identity-based than it is issue-based. And there's actually research that shows this, that we are more divided based on how much we don't like the people on the other side than based on the level of disagreement that we have on policies. And I think a big part of how that happens is that I'll tell you sort of like what the research is on this. There's a lot of research on social sorting. The political parties over the last however many years have become increasingly aligned with other factors, things like race, religion, et cetera. And so you no longer have as much diversity as maybe you used to have within the parties. And when you start to get divides along those lines, they're more sticky identities, sort of harder to change. And when the political divides get associated with that, it's really complicating. But because the polarization goes from, and the other thing is the threat narrative, right? The idea that that other side is a threat. And so we've gone from being like, we really disagree with each other on an issue, but I fundamentally think that you could still be a good person, to the idea that you're on another team, right? And it's a lot less actually about the issues. The issues get bundled up, and I think often the issues are kind of like badges of belonging, right? If somebody tells you what they think on one issue, you assume what team they belong to, and you assume a whole lot of other things about them. You assume they believe every single thing on that team. You make a lot of assumptions about why when we're in conflict with each other, when groups are in conflict. You tend to, for example, it's called motive attribution asymmetry. There's been research on this too, by Jeremy Gingas and others, but where like, they're acting out of hate. Whatever they're doing is because they hate us. Whatever we're doing, it's because we love ourselves, right? And there's research on like both sides of a conflict. Each side will think that. They're acting out of hate, but we're acting out of love. Why is someone really acting? It's kind of beyond the point. We have this perception that we are acting out of a fundamentally different motivation than someone on another side. And you see that around wedge issues like gun control and abortion in the United States, that you're not just making an assumption or an assessment of what someone thinks about the issue. We tend to, and the way those conversations go is it's an assumption about the motivation behind it. And there's a whole lot of other sort of like processes that come online when we're in conflict with a group and that give us this feedback loop where we start to see ourselves as more and more different, and the other group, they hate us, they're out to get us, right? That's a very threatening narrative. And so when we come polarized based on identity, again, it's a lot less like a nice friendly debate where we really virulently disagree and we can get worked up, but we're just like debating an issue. It's like team sports. And guess what? Somebody on my team like fouled, and like, ref, you better not call that. That's so unfair. But when they did, every one of their fans supports that, and how could they try and hurt us, right? Like, and it becomes a lot more about I want my team to win and your team is a threat to my team because only one of us can win, than it does whatever the issue that we're talking about. So I think that's a long answer to your question, but I think that before we start to ask what can we do about the polarization, we have to say what is it that we're experiencing? What we're experiencing is a fundamentally different type of polarization. It's existed along different fractures in American history, but we're experiencing a rise of that identity-based polarization along partisan political lines right now. And I think because of that, you can have the normalization of speech and rhetoric that people might not otherwise be okay with, but you're going to be more okay with it because your group is doing it. And you're going to defend your team because the other team is such a threat. And it's okay, like somebody on your team did a foul, and we can sort of like turn a blind eye to it. So I think that type of polarization is very, very dangerous. But what it also means for intervening is it's very hard to start with the issues because it's not really about issues, right? You have to muddle some of these processes and these feedback loops that have come online by starting with how did somebody come to care? If you're having a conversation, and there's no perfect remedy, this is really hard stuff. But instead of starting by debating the issue, start by doing a back and forth sharing of how did you come to care about this issue? When did you first learn about this issue? When did it first come into your consciousness? What did you first think about it? Has your thinking evolved at all? Why? What? What events shaped your thinking about this issue, right? You're asking someone their story of how and why they came to care and sharing your story of how and why you came to care about an issue. And you'll often discover that there are some misconceptions and you can find an inroad to a conversation. But I think that the really important point there is that the inroad's usually not going to be straight through the issue because that's not actually, I mean, it's a problem. Some of these, when we talk about the acceptance of hateful or dangerous rhetoric, that is a problem. But it's enabled by this dynamic of this identity.
One more question from somebody who hasn't had a chance to ask a question yet. Yes.
So my question is, so we're talking about also polarization, especially with identities. And when going on social media, especially like Facebook, when people are discussing topics, do you think being able to be behind the screen really affects that conversation because you're not able to get to the why are you thinking like this? What were the perceived conditions? It's more like just attacking and making fun of someone so other people see it.
Yeah, and I think there's a broader dynamic there, right? It's usually not a one-on-one conversation, it's a public conversation. And so you have this norm question too, right? When somebody posts something mean or awful, then everybody else looking at it knows if I say something, I might become a target of that type of speech. So you have a lot of people that are just observing and not saying anything. So all these dynamics that play out like in a public space and like offline start to play out in that online. And you can think about it, again, like if we think about a middle school where there's a bully, right? And the bully is targeting a lot of different people. You have people that don't like what they're seeing and that might be able to engage with each other otherwise, but they don't want to become the subject of that, right? So when we see this online bullying behavior, even just like really negative, hateful comments and things like that, it becomes a lot scarier for people to participate who might not feel so strongly or who might not feel comfortable or who might it takes a level of bravery to engage in that type of environment. So I think it stymies that conversation, not just because it's harder to like create that personal connection, but I think you maybe could in an online, and you can. There's stories of people actually creating those types of connections, and even people who are like in extremist groups being sort of brought to conversation, but it's that one-on-one safe conversation that you can have, whereas that very public conversation where there is that bullying and harassment, and there's the capacity for people to do that when they're committed to it, especially, right? I think it's a very hard environment for productive engagement, not just because of that two-way communication, but because it really shuts down the opportunity for others to engage. And it's part of that, it's like a little mirror of that broader societal dynamic we talked about, right? There might be one person or a few people saying really hateful things and a whole lot of people being silent for a whole lot of different reasons, right? This isn't worth my time. What a mess. I don't want to waste my time on this. I don't know what to say that could be helpful. I don't want to be targeted, right? And so an intervention for that isn't just about like the hateful speaker and isn't just about what they're saying. We have to also ask, what is the communication ecosystem around this, right? Like, who are the other people that are being silent or not speaking, and how could we make it easier or safer to engage these other voices? And we see that on the trajectory to mass atrocities. One of the first things is the shutting down of credible opposition voices. And I think maybe since this was my last question, I'll end with this, is that when we look about how a society moves towards mass atrocity, genocide, and other forms of identity-based violence, it is not just everyone being mobilized to perpetrate those actions, right? Silence, disengagement, apathy, those are just as critically important, and they are fostered early on in that process. And I think when we start to see these patterns, and this is something I think really matters and that we need to learn a lot more about, when we start to see these patterns upstream, where are those opportunities to not just prevent the movement towards violence, but also prevent the silencing that really so fosters and enables a society to move that way.
Well, thank you. Please join me in thanking.
Thanks, everybody. Really enjoyed talking to you.